Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's Documents in Detail webinar for Wednesday, April 21st, 2021. The focus of tonight's program was Abraham Lincoln's resolution submitting the 13th Amendment to the states. As always, our moderator was Dr. John Moser, professor of history at Ashland University, and he was joined by Dr. Elizabeth Amato, professor of political science at Gardner-Webb University, and Dr. Andrew Lang, professor of history at Mississippi State University. Thanks again for listening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I am professor of history and chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series, in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically important documents. We encourage all of you joining us this evening to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A box. Please, the Q&A box and not the chat box. I'd rather not have to pay attention to both of them. We will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, if you would like one, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from tonight's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from our book, 50 Core American Documents. They're also available at the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database located at tah.org. The subject of this evening's program is Abraham Lincoln's resolution submitting the 13th Amendment to the states. And to help discuss that document are Dr. Elizabeth Amato, Associate Professor of Political Science for the Department of Social Science at Gardner-Webb University, and Dr. Andrew Lang, Associate Professor of History at Mississippi State University. Both Professors Amato and Lang are faculty members in Ashland University's Master's Program in American History and Government. Elizabeth, Andrew, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So the way I like to start these off is by asking if there is, why does this document deserve to be included in a volume of 50 core American documents? Why is it that important?
I'll start. Well, the 13th Amendment is crucial for the development of the Constitution. We tend to focus on the 14th Amendment's transformation of the relationship between the federal and the state governments, but it is more accurate to say that it's really the 13th Amendment that does it. It's really the 13th Amendment that sets minimum standards for civic and personal liberty that must be respected by the states. And that really is a fundamental transformation and change to our Constitution.
Yeah, I will add to that the 13th Amendment is both symbolic and very tangible in its implications based on what had come in the 5-6 decades prior in American history. Abraham Lincoln called the 13th Amendment the King's cure-all for all the evils. And in his mind, this was the great finality to the long crisis of slavery in the federal union. And even though we can look back on the 13th Amendment and see its seeming shortcomings in it, we should also look forward from the perspective of the people who passed it in 1865 to see it as a grand finale, a triumph, a conclusion to the roiling decades of sectionalism over slavery.
Okay, well then let's talk next about context. You may not be aware of this, but last month we featured the final Emancipation Proclamation. Any kind of information that you could provide us to take us from the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation up to Lincoln's submission of the 13th Amendment, anything that could help us connect the dots between the two would be appreciated.
Elizabeth, do you want to go first on that?
In fact, let me, right in line with this, Zachary Rice has asked, Could you assess the role that the Emancipation Proclamation had in the development of the 13th Amendment? Is there a strong connection between the two documents, in your opinion? Probably, Zachary probably put it better than I did.
I'll start if you like. Absolutely, it is actually a continuation, or it is a completion. I like the way that you, Andrew, put it, as there is a kind of a capstone or a finality, at least in terms of the slavery question in the United States. I'd actually maybe put it a slightly broader context, that the Emancipation Proclamation is part of a series of actions by Congress, and also President Lincoln, that is trying to undo the Dred Scott decision, and that the Emancipation Proclamation is very, very carefully drawn to be within clearly Lincoln's executive authority and wartime powers. But there's no guarantee that's going to stick, given what the Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott, that the Supreme Court essentially said that to free Dred Scott, that you can't, right? It undoes the Missouri Compromise and says that there is a substantive permanent property in the slave that cannot be undone without due process of law. That's still law. Like, that's still a Supreme Court ruling, and unless you get that amendment added to the Constitution, that's the only means available to Congress and Lincoln to undo that decision.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I don't think that we can place too much emphasis on the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation, as Elizabeth said, is an executive order. And it's an executive order drawn entirely out of the context of the rebellion against federal authority. The only thing, well, there's a number of things that give the proclamation teeth, but one of them is secession and the Confederate rebellion itself. Without those, the Emancipation Proclamation, as it was conceived in its final form, has no authority. It's only a wartime measure. Lincoln acknowledges that. And he's even drawing, particularly in the preliminary proclamation, but also in the spirit of the final, he's drawing on the Second Confiscation Act passed in July of 1862. So he's relying on legislative legitimacy from the Congress, which he considers the principal branch of government. But there's an issue that he's very aware of, and that is a future court declaring null and void the Emancipation Proclamation at some point in the future, which then raises the question, well, what about congressional legislation to address freeing of enslaved people? Well, a future Congress could rewrite that law. A future Supreme Court could overturn that law. And thus it's almost required then to have a constitutional amendment to deal in finality with this impossible problem.
How does this document dovetail with Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction, which have already been announced at this point?
Well, in the sense that this is part of it. It basically, he sets it up that you want to come back into the Union, you need to ratify this. It also furthers his understanding that the Southern states, the Confederate states, I should say, never left the Union. That to actually add the amendment, because of course it requires 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the state. What's the total number of states? It's the total number of states, including the Confederate, because they never left. They need to ratify it to actually become. So I think there were, if I remember correctly, I tried looking this up, 36 states at the time, took 27 to actually ratify it. So it's a crucial part of actually getting Reconstruction going in that sense.
Yeah, totally. We also need to remember that Lincoln was very uncomfortable with the very term Reconstruction, because it implies that something fundamental has to change in the constitutional and federal structure. And in his mind, there is no fundamental reconstruction that needs to take place. It is a restoration, bringing bringing the rebellious states back into their proper political function, into the federal orbit. And so I'm not sure if it's so much a requirement for the so-called Confederate states to ratify it, more so than it's essential in its symbolism to have former slave states signing on to a national consensus. And the same goes for Lincoln's insistence that the amendment be passed by Democratic votes in the House of Representatives. When the Republicans won the 1864 election, they would have had enough votes to pass the amendment once the new Congress convenes in 1865 with zero Democratic support. But politically and symbolically, it is critical to have Democrats on board. And I think that they got 13. I think the Republicans got 13 Democratic votes to pass the amendment before the new Congress convened in 1865. And so it speaks to, I think, Lincoln's view of always having a consensus, always having a will of a very diverse populace signing on to what are otherwise pretty radical changes. And so you can have radical change through conservative and moderating means. And that's what his whole worldview is about.
This gets us to a question by Heath Treat. Did the former Confederate states have any leverage at all in this, or was this they better ratify this or not, or else?
I will say that this the answer somewhat eludes me. My level of knowledge on that doesn't quite extend. I don't think they really had any leverage. I mean, they're really not going to. I would add that just if I could dovetail to something that Andrew mentioned, that Lincoln gives his annual address, or State of the Union as we call it, in December, and it really is a beautiful sort of appeal that for a kind of a bipartisan ratification here. Because you're right, he wouldn't need the Republican, or he wouldn't need Democrats once the new Congress came into session. So he asks actually a lame duck Congress to do it. And in a weird way, it's a sort of compelling those reticent Democrats to recognize that there is and has been a shift in public opinion. Because a lot of those, of course, are Northern Democrats. They also got, a lot of them promised some pretty plum positions if they since they got kicked out of office, there or other relatives. Lincoln was pretty savvy with patronage. Anyway, I'm sorry that doesn't fully answer your question.
Yeah, this is a really important question, because there's nothing that, at least from Lincoln's perspective, there's nothing that is forcing the Confederate states to ratify this as a condition of returning to the Union, because the way he framed it as, regardless of whether we're going to coerce you or not, which he didn't, he wasn't going to do that. Regardless of whether we, the Union, are going to coerce you into ratifying this is a moot point, because you will be back in the Union, and we do have enough states, slaveholding or otherwise, to get the 3/4 ratification threshold. So it's kind of pointless to even debate whether you can have leverage. And this is the point he makes. So he goes down to Virginia, I believe. I can't remember my dates, but right around the time the House passes it at the end of January, I think he goes down to Virginia at the beginning of February to meet with Confederate peace commissioners. There's a really great scene of this in the movie Lincoln, which we could talk about later, because I have a lot of issues with that movie. But there's a great scene where he tells Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, this very point, that the slavery issue is done. And so now the only question remaining is when, not if, but when the rebellion ends and the Confederate states rejoin their proper place in now an inevitably anti-slavery union. There's something else that Lincoln was calculating. He was watching several border states, Maryland in particular. Maryland actually, a slaveholding state, abolished slavery in 1864 as part of a new state constitution. And so Lincoln used this as his point of leverage to show Confederates in any future peace negotiation, look, there are already slaveholding states moving in the direction that we all know the nation is heading. And so the slavery issue is dead. It's just a matter of when.
I have scribbled in the margin, ask about the Lincoln movie. So we'll get to that. We'll get to that at some point. Jeffrey Beguil, I apologize if I mangled that. He's asking about the ominous clause, quote, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, which we know means that in practice, a lot of former slaves would be accused of crimes, tried and convicted, and could end up in a situation that's almost identical to what they had been presumably liberated from. Could you comment on that?
I guess we've gotten over to habit. I'll go first. Yeah, so that clause there is obviously referring, even that clause though is limited. It is designed to create a limit that this type of compelled or forced labor could only occur under conditions of being duly convicted and you're imprisoned or something of that nature. And it's important to recognize that it is actually trying to exclude peonage, which is when you might be indebted. This is a practice that is becoming very popular, where people become indebted, they have to work off their debt. So it is eliminating that. Congress does pass a bill, I want to say Anti-Peonage Act of
67.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That actually does eliminate that. The Supreme Court actually, despite other errors that the Supreme Court makes in interpreting the 13th and 14th Amendment, it does actually a pretty good job of, when cases actually reach it, which are rare and unfortunately rare, of striking down various examples of peonage and involuntary servitude in those sort of cases. But you are right that it does open up a possibility, one that the writers of the amendment did not foresee. It was not debated in Congress, to my knowledge, and it is against their intention, that cycle of, oh, well, let's convict this Black man for a pretty minor crime, then we can put them, into forced labor. That was not part of the original intention, and it is certainly against the spirit of it. But that is, of course, what does occur in the later 19th and some of the early 20th century. And the Supreme Court that's actually been the clause that, in a way, or one of the clauses or parts of the whole amendment that has had a lot of litigation. It does eliminate things like religious cults. It has broader application in other areas. It cannot get you out of jury duty. However, that is something that Supreme Court was like, it doesn't apply to civic duty. No.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? How common was convict labor at the time this amendment was proposed?
I do not actually know that.
Well, I can't speak to how ubiquitous it was, but Elizabeth is absolutely right in what ultimately happens by the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. Incidentally, there's a great book on this by Douglas Blackman called Slavery by Another Name that speaks to this issue. But here's what we do know, or here's what I can speak to add to this. So this is one of the really unanticipated, insidious outcomes right off the bat with the 13th Amendment. And that is Southern states who are walking a tightrope in the summer, fall, and winter of 1865, who see the writing on the wall, see that regardless of whether their respective state is going to ratify, the amendment is going to be ratified. After Lincoln is assassinated, his successor, of course, President Andrew Johnson, Democrat from Tennessee, he also does not compel or force the former Confederate states to ratify, but he strongly encourages it as a sign of good faith. But he also tells several governors that, look, The amendment does not speak to anything about individual rights for freed people. It does not limit what a state or locale can do in curtailing freed people's rights. And so this is when we see in the summer and fall of 1865, the advent of the notorious Black Codes, which do just that in the most explicit ways, very, very explicit ways, limit and curtail freedom and make it, criminal offenses to be past city curfews. Freed people can't own firearms. They're forced into labor contracts with former plantation owners. And so this is the roundabout way to criminalizing freedom, which then only accelerates over the next few decades. And I don't want to jump too far afield, but this is really how we get indirectly to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, and then the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, all of which are measures to define what freedom means in the 13th Amendment.
Joanna Wasili asks, what do you make of the stretch of time that elapsed between the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which was the inspiration for the wording of this amendment, and the timing of the 13th Amendment? Was that telling of the overall stance of the nation?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, I do want to highlight the wording is very similar, and that's very intentional. Because of course, much of the battle that Lincoln had been participating in prior to the Civil War was over Congress's authority over the territories, and that by using very similar language as the Northwest Ordinance, it was intentional to show very firmly, and even putting it into the Constitution, that Congress does have this power. If there was ever any doubt, here you go. It's right here. It's the same wording. And so I'm not quite sure if I understand where you may be going with the question, but it is indicating a kind of, again, a completion, or we have now moved from where Congress, or it's an expansion of liberty, right? We've moved from, actually, here, I'll actually make a real sentence this time instead of just restarting them. But if you actually look at the original Northwest Ordinance, it has very similar language to the 13th, but it's immediately followed by a fugitive slave clause, very similar to the one that is also in the Constitution. And so we actually see an expansion of liberty from that point in time to the 13th Amendment, in which, we're asserting Congress's power over the territories. And then, it takes that 77 years to get, or a little longer at this point, to get to the point of Congress is firmly eliminating, and does possess the power to eliminate slavery throughout all of the states. Set up those minimum standards of civil liberty, and even to begin, obviously at this point, you no longer need a fugitive slave clause at all. It's just eliminated. It's gone from the Constitution.
There are some additional matters at play as well. So I can't think of a different way to say this, but we have to recognize just how unbelievably powerful, transformative, and most importantly, unexpected the American Civil War was. We know that the war happens, right? We know that the 13th Amendment is the great cap in 1865 to the end of a 4-year-long Civil War. And in many ways, it's the Civil War that accelerates the process of emancipation, which otherwise was taking an incredibly slow amount of time, and Lincoln speaks to this. There's a great letter, I would assume many of you are familiar with it, that he writes in 1855 to a friend in Kentucky, and he's furious. You can just see, or you can't see, but you can read and sense the frustration, because in this letter he's talking about how the founding set a precedent for gradually ending slavery. And he points to the Northwest Ordinance, but he also points to state by state emancipation that happens from the 1780s until the early 19th century. And he's telling his friend, look, the spirit of the revolution accelerated this state by state gradual emancipation, and then it halted. And then we started going the other way as the 19th century went on. And his point is that in this system, in a federal republic, only the states can abolish slavery. It is a state issue. And it's something that he never wavers from until about midway through the American Civil War. He talks about how essential it is to maintain the rule of law in protecting slavery, because it's not about protecting slavery more so than it is about protecting the process and purpose of law. But as slaveholders grew in disproportionate political power during the 19th century, largely on the basis of controlling the federal government through the 3/5 clause, there's a reason why you can make a case that the early 19th century union was a slaveholders union, even if it was disproportionate. And in Lincoln's argument, this was never expected, this was never anticipated by the founding. And so you have to have something like a war, a rebellion against federal authority to occasion something as truly radical, at least in the mid-19th century, as emancipation and the 13th Amendment in the forms in which they took.
Could I add something to that?
Please.
To just highlight that about the kind of radical nature of it and how sort of transformative the Civil War is and how the movement towards emancipation speeds up. It's interesting to note that in the debates about the 13th Amendment in Congress, you still have people arguing that 13th Amendment is unconstitutional because it violates states' rights.
Right.
Like, they're not letting go of that doctrine. And it is become the doctrine of states' rights really does supersede that earlier understanding of the, Constitution, as you describe, as the sort of traditional federalism. But it just is a marvel to read these arguments to say that a amendment cannot be passed that would at all that states' rights is the higher principle, I guess, is the more phenomenal or curious facet of that argument. You read that and you're just like, wow, like it's hard to imagine the depth to which those ideas had infiltrated. And again, most of these people that we're talking about are Northern Democrats. There's even some moderate or some very, very conservative, sort of leftover Whiggish Republicans who are also still willing to sort of concede that point as well. That is granted also before the 1864 election, which after the losses in Congress in the midterm, people are starting to waver on, but still, it's kind of an extraordinary shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to add something to that, because this question is really important. We live in an era now, I mean, even though we haven't had a constitutional amendment since, fact check me, 92? Is that what it is? Okay. Amendments make sense to us, right? But the 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, is again, fact check me, is the first since the founding era. When was the 12th Amendment?
The 12th Amendment, it's shortly thereafter. Yeah. It's like 1807, maybe.
Yeah, okay.
It could be somewhere right around there.
And the point of that is that's on purpose. So let's cut the difference, say 1810. I don't know. 1810 from the 12th Amendment all the way to 1865 to the 13th. That's on purpose, because there's a general consensus in American cultural and political thought that amending the Constitution is anathema to the Union, because then you're acknowledging, even though there's multiple mechanisms of amending the Constitution, the very act of it may suggest that the founders got something wrong, and that we're tampering with the document as they conceived this sacred, holy charter. We are acknowledging in future generations that something may be off about it. And Lincoln himself was very skeptical of amending the Constitution, particularly when it came to the slavery issue. This is something that he had to gradually warm up to, and it was his advisors, really, in early 1864, who show him the necessity of this. But even Lincoln makes a pseudo states' rights argument in justifying the amendment to not only himself, but the American people, though he becomes a genuine full-fledged supporter of it. He says that the very act of ratification is a state-by-state issue from the consent of the people. And so he's arguing that even though it's enshrined into the federal Constitution, the very act of sanctioning it depends on the states, which is I've always found to be a good way of balancing the state right argument.
Sorry, we'll do this another question, but there is, oh, I forget the congressman, but there is a congressman who makes the, is arguing back and forth and about this and makes the beautiful point about what the Constitution is. It is actually an original expression of we the people. And so the amendment, because he's arguing against states' rights, no, actually the amendment does flow from we the people acting through the states and obviously the elected representatives. But it's a really amazing high level constitutional analysis that you're getting there.
Yeah, definitely.
Excuse me. Our good friend Ken Masugi, hi Ken, asks a couple of questions. I won't give them to you both right now. The first one, does the 13th Amendment require the 14th and 15th, or does not being a slave necessarily mean the fulfillment of the Declaration of Independence? Does not being a slave also require the non-existence of masters and therefore a regime of Republican equality?
So that's an easy question to answer in a short amount of time. I'd say that, and this is where we're going to get into the fun question of exactly what is that relationship between the 13th and the 14th Amendment. There's certainly, I think you have to have you have to. You need the 13th, or sorry, you need the 14th and the 15th if your goal is actually to make free African Americans full citizens, but obviously all men. 19th Amendment's another issue. But it is necessary to do that in a very complete and unambiguous way. I'm not opposed to arguments. This is where I like to lean on Justice Harlan in his dissent in Plessy, because he makes the really wonderful point at the very, very beginning about the 13th Amendment, that there are certain rights that inhere in actually being free. There's a positive side to the 13th Amendment, and he's drawing on precedent here. He's actually not, Stuger, okay, I have this v. West Virginia. Where is it? I have it here. Strotter, there we go. Strotter v. West Virginia. Wow. Where the court argues there is a positive affirming side to the 13th Amendment. It is, if you make people free, which is what the amendment does, there is a body of rights that belong to a free person that they have intrinsically. What those are, and the court never fully fleshes all of those out, but they include certain basic things that Harlan would mention, like freedom of locomotion, freedom to move freely, rights to marry, rights to own property, obviously right to your fruit of your labor, that kind of stuff. It may include other things, but being free at least establishes a basic minimum of bundle of rights. It's not necessarily, I think, and as full of all of the civil rights that we would certainly want or demand today, but and that's what I think you really do need to pull a 14th Amendment to clarify that. There's a good argument to be made that you could do it on the basis of the 13th Amendment, but you weren't going to persuade people of it. Maybe that's the more basic thing, is I think there's a certain argument that logically, if you're going to make people free, I'm happy to go down the philosophic road of saying, well, if you do that, then you have to get rid of the discrimination. You can't do that. Justice Stewart makes a great argument in Jones v. Alfred v. Mayer in 1968 that you can strike down discriminatory private acts based on the 13th Amendment. But in terms of persuading people in the 19th century, you were going to need another amendment to really clearly authorize both Congress's power and to really be clear about exactly what you meant. So I'll stop there and keep this a little short.
Andrew.
Yeah, no, it's a great explanation, and it's right on, of course. The architects of the 14th Amendment, or I should say, to go in chronological order, the architects of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and right after that, the 14th Amendment, and by implication, the 15th Amendment, made this exact argument. And they're making the argument because of the way Andrew Johnson and the Southern states are themselves defining and executing freedom in the way that they're interpreting the 13th Amendment. They saw freedom as nothing more than the absence of slavery. It was no more complicated than that. Beyond that, the state and the locale, as we discussed earlier, could limit and curtail rights based on race. They were very explicit about that. And so the Republicans who authored the Civil Rights Act of 66 and the 14th Amendment, let me just give you one quote here. Let's see, I don't have a name for this person. But the object of the 14th Amendment is to punish arbitrary deprivation of political power based upon race or color by reduced representation. No object could be more laudable. And then I've got one more. Let's see. John Bingham from Ohio, one of the amendment's main authors, said that the 14th Amendment bolstered the essential provisions housed in the Republic's national charters, divine in their justice, sublime in their humility, which declare that all men are equal in the rights of life and liberty before the majesty of American law. Charles Sumner added to this point, I believe in 1867, when he's reflecting on the state of liberty and equality in the Atlantic world. And he said, if I can paraphrase, something about how France has perfected equality at the expense of liberty. Britain has perfected liberty at the expense of equality. Let us perfect them both in tandem, liberty and equality. And that's what he's speaking about here, is that freedom is contingent. The natural right to freedom is contingent upon one's liberty from coercion and state-sanctioned oppression. So I would not go so far as, and I'm always telling my students this, I would not go so far as to say that the 14th Amendment is the inevitable outgrowth of the 13th Amendment, and it's certainly not the inevitable outgrowth of emancipation. We should understand that all this is contingent upon events on the ground, but in spirit, I think they're absolutely consistent with each other.
Okay, here is the second part of Ken's question. Does the 13th Amendment invigorate Article 4 of the original Constitution with its various privileges and immunities of state citizenship, along with a new definition of guarantee of Republican government?
I wish the privileges and immunities clause meant something. I mean, the privileges and immunities clause is a tricky bit of business. It's got a mangled history. It had a poor history even before the 14th Amendment. There's not a lot of talk about it at the Constitutional Convention. It's not clear exactly what it's guaranteeing. I have recently, and I feel very persuaded by this article that I have read. I don't know if it's just because it's the recentness of having read it, but that, the sort of original understanding of it is more of a natural rights argument, that there really were supposed to be these minimum, rights that were enjoyed by all citizens that you were to enjoy regardless of what state you were in. That was based on a natural right understanding, and they would largely be things or rights that all citizens enjoyed. It's not how the amendment ultimately became understood. Became understood more of as a function of positive law, in which if you're a citizen of one state, you go to another state, all the provision does is it prevents discrimination against you according to whatever rights that host state recognizes for its citizens. And that's a more narrow view. It's even, I think, the view that Justice Curtis takes up in Dred Scott, but it is a more narrow view. And it's something like that still the court flourishes and runs with in say the slaughterhouse cases and whatnot, but it is more narrow in that way. I do think that the Republican Guarantee Clause is in a way invigorated, or it certainly reminds us that it was there, right? Abolitionists tried to remind people in the antebellum period that, hey, there's this Republican Guarantee Clause that looks like it's getting totally trampled. And there is a kind of a renewed interest in it. I actually just read the full dissent, hadn't in a while, for Harlan in Plessy, and he actually ends the dissent with a call that someone will one day litigate separate but equal, kind of on the grounds that it is a violation of the Republican Guarantee Clause. Certainly the court has taken up the Republican Guarantee Clause more closely in the area of voting rights. But in other ways, we, I think, are more attuned in even informal ways about whether our governments are adhering to Republican principles.
Andrew.
I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I'm not even going to pretend to make up anything in answering that part of the question, except to say, and this probably won't even come close to answering the question, but I think that we talked about this briefly earlier, but we should focus on Section 2 of the 13th Amendment, which at least in the popular imagination, obviously doesn't get as much play as Section 1, understandably so. But the very fact that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, I think ultimately helps us see and understand why Congress, so soon after the 13th Amendment, does finally offer a national definition of citizenship, which had never happened, at least in the way it did in the 1860s, up to that point. And so I think that matters, establishing a national conception of who is a citizen and what rights that entails. That's how I always teach the relation, or one of the many relations between the 13th and 14th Amendment.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think sorry, I didn't interrupt there, but I think that's exactly correct, right? It is in a way like the next. If you say that the 13th Amendment is a kind of an ending point, it's also another beginning.
Totally.
And the 14th Amendment is furthering that, because what comes next, right? Well, what is citizenship?
Yep.
John Banks asks, had the Civil War not occurred, would there ever have been enough votes to change the Constitution and outlaw slavery?
That is one of those great what ifs. I don't know is the honest answer. No one can, but that letter that you allude to, Andrew, the one that Lincoln wrote, that's what people at the time thought, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when you that's the evidence you have. What are the people thinking at the time in the 1850s? It just, things were bad. You had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that's horrific. You had the Fugitive Slave Act, all of those things. None of these are positive signs, and it does look, for all intents and purposes, that people are forgetting what the founding meant in that way, or that what liberty was. I would like to think that it would have been possible, right? Because that's kind of the beauty of it is kind of the romance even of the founding. We're just gonna get rid of slavery. We're gonna do it state by state. It's gonna be awesome. We're gonna do it through manumission. It's gonna be fabulous. And I think to some extent it underestimates the level of kind of iniquity in the human heart. I don't know. I doubt it. I guess I'll stick with that.
Yeah, and I think it also underestimates how powerful, politically powerful, American slaveholders were in 1860. You have most of the Western world abolishing unfree labor. If memory serves, the United States, Cuba, and Brazil are the only slaveholding regions left in the Western Hemisphere by 1860. If American slavery were its own, well, it was its own industry in 1860, it would be ranked in today's dollars as the 11th most profitable industry in the entire world. In 1860, it was valued at, or at least the human value in property was valued at $3.3 billion, which was more than all national railroad, banking, and industrial capacity in the United States. American slaveholders have grown, increasingly politically powerful, and there's no reason to think that any near future this power and influence would have abated. Now, of course, the increase in immigration and population to the north would probably mean, well, most likely would mean an increased number in Republican political influence. But again, we don't know. Lincoln famously said he predicted that slavery would die out sometime after 1900. But I don't think that I certainly don't think it was on a decline by any stretch. We also have to understand what we do know. Lincoln tried the process of gradual compensated emancipation right off the bat. Didn't use the crisis of the war to do something as radical as the Second Confiscation Act, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment. He went with what he knew and what he believed in. State-sanctioned gradual compensated emancipation over a course of decades. And of course, we know what happens. The loyal slaveholding border states reject it. That rejection is meaningful in trying to grapple with this question. It's only get lost. And it's only that rejection that compels Republicans to think of new, unprecedented ways of approaching the slavery question. And looming right in front of all this and around it is the war itself. It has to be the war to occasion the kind of emancipation and abolition that we're talking about. Without the war and its aftermath, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments look absolutely nothing the way they actually do. And another piece of evidence to this is the other 13th Amendment passed by Congress in the early winter of 1861. 13th Amendment, which would have guaranteed the protection of slavery where it existed, with a corollary that no amendment could be added to the Constitution that would target slavery. And that was passed by Congress as a way to keep the seceded states loyal into the Union. Lincoln talks about this amendment in his first inaugural address. And he even submitted that amendment to the states for ratification. I personally don't think that he liked it, but because the Congress passed it and his predecessor had approved it, he submitted it. And 6 states, I want to say 5 or 6 states ratified it. And you know, that was far more likely to transpire than not.
Okay. Kristen Schumer asks, how much of a role did the radical Republicans play in the passage of the 13th Amendment as compared to the 14th and 15th Amendments?
Well, they got more radical. That's sort of the short answer, is that in a way that the 13th Amendment, by comparison, looks like there are obviously, you've got, radical Republicans who are pushing this along, and Lincoln in a way is trying to manage both their pushes as well as holding together, while also trying to maintain presidential power of Reconstruction. That's all trying to happen. The 13th Amendment is the sort of more moderate one, and their power gets augmented in part because the reaction to the 13th Amendment the Black Codes ticked them off because they did understand the 13th Amendment as in containing a bundle of rights, and they wanted to see it happen. And the fact that it wasn't, Congress did what it does best. They gave testimony, they read things, they read these just horrible stories, genuinely horrible stories of things that were happening, and that in a way, that certainly augments their power into the 14th Amendment. That's one reason why when you look at the 14th Amendment, it's really long, it's really complete. Even something, it's just really, really sort of fulsome. And that power or that influence that they are having, they're kind of on a moral high. This is also unpleasant to think about, but Lincoln dies, and that turns out to be a benefit, if you will, for his party. You get a kind of a sympathy support after that. I would have rather Lincoln not die, but that kind of augments the flow, where they can really get those amendments passed. Honestly, I find the 15th Amendment's passage, as late as it is, to be almost a little surprising that kind of steam and enthusiasm for civil rights is still holding at that point. Because Lincoln, in some of the things that he's writing in, obviously 64, 65, he's actually kind of like, we got to get this 13th Amendment out the door before enthusiasm, thins. And what's kind of amazing is that it is sustained as long as it is.
Yeah, I really like this question for a number of reasons. But first, Elizabeth mentioned the momentum for the 15th Amendment 5 years after the war. And I always like what President Grant said about the 15th Amendment. He said it was a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day, which is very telling. After becoming a very committed ideological Republican and a devotee of Lincoln, out of everything that he had seen over the past decade, that's what he ascribes of grander importance since the founding. And of course, it's all tied in together. But going back to the question, so the radical Republicans spearheaded the 13th or the proposed 13th Amendment during the middle of the war. It was the brainchild of a congressman from Ohio, James Ashley, who proposed a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery in December, maybe, 1863. Of course, it didn't go anywhere initially, but increasing numbers of Republicans started to consent to the idea, and they all populated the more radical branch of the party. But as is always the case, or always the case, this is sometimes the case with the radical idea, it has to be planted, at least to get people to think about it, right? And then the notion spreads and moderates so as to accommodate a growing consensus. But an original proposal for the 13th Amendment, not from Ashley, but from Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, he proposed one in early 1864 that said, all persons are equal before the law, so that no person can hold another as a slave. And Congress shall have no power to make laws, or shall have power to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out this declaration. But it's that first clause. Sumner is stating what is implicit in the ratified 13th Amendment, but all persons are equal before the law. And of course, that was a no-go for some Republicans and certainly all Democrats as a way to get any kind of 13th Amendment passed. That language of equality is not going to be anywhere near the final version. Otherwise, it will just not get approved. But you can see where radicals' minds are at the very beginning of this question about amending the Constitution.
Could I add something to that?
Please do.
I would even say that you're right. I really like how you put it, that there's the you mentioned that the language kind of gets dropped from the 13th Amendment, and then the radical Republicans push and make it explicit. There's even, I'd say, a tendency that we look back on the 13th Amendment with their eyes rather than anybody else's for that precise reason. We see implicit in the 13th Amendment more so, and we privilege that view, which I'm not entirely sad about, but
no, totally. And we know that, at least philosophically, intellectually, Lincoln is there on the question of natural equality. But politically, there's no way he's ever going to propose having that kind of language in an amendment for purely pragmatic political reasons. And we know this from his insisting that enough Democrats get on board.
Well, there's no way we can get to all the questions that have been asked, but I do want to go back to the Lincoln movie. Tell me your thoughts on that film.
I'll go first this time, since I brought it up earlier. So first and foremost, it is an exceptional piece of work. Daniel Day-Lewis performs. I don't think we'll ever see a portrayal of Lincoln better. And just the majesty, the triumphalism of the movie, the inevitability of the movie. It's great to watch, but that's what makes it so problematic. So the movie begins with this unbelievable scene in which two African-American soldiers walk up to Lincoln and start reciting from, and I think there's a white soldier too, and they all start reciting the Gettysburg Address from memory. Nobody would have done that. The Gettysburg Address by early 1864 is an afterthought. Just read what the popular press wrote about the Gettysburg Address. They thought that it was an insult to the occasion of dedicating a national cemetery, very different from how we view it today. So nobody would have come up to Lincoln and quoted it, and they certainly wouldn't have quoted it with the assumption that Lincoln was talking exclusively about this war being a crusade to end slavery and a crusade to end or to occasion racial equality. That's the problem of the movie, is that it puts us, just drops us right in 1864 and lets us assume that there's a forward momentum from the very beginning that the Republicans brought with them to wage war exclusively to end slavery, and the 13th Amendment is that natural, inevitable conclusion. What is lost from the movie Lincoln entirely is the concept of union and why union mattered more than anything to the vast majority of the loyal citizenry and Lincoln himself. So that's my soapbox. Still watch it. It's excellent. It's probably been about 2 months. I need to watch it again.
Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts on the movie Lincoln?
I do. Well, I have a confession. I've not seen it.
Oh.
So, I've been wary of it because I guess I knew people said that Daniel Day-Lewis did a just magnificent job, but I kind of was wary of where was the movie going to go, and I didn't want to leave it and be angry. So on your recommendation, with those caveats that it's a little too inevitable, a little too unfolding of history in one direction without the kind of, I like movies better when, even though we know what's going to happen, because we do, it shows us that the characters don't, right? Or the complexity of the things that are kind of motivating their desires. But at any rate.
And that's kind of the thing, because I'd say at least a third of the movie is about just the great 19th century smoke-filled whiskey-barreled rooms of back and forth politics. You know, you vote for this, we'll give you that, back and forth. That in itself belies the inevitability that the spirit of the movie wants to push forth. That actually is one of the great parts about it, is just to show the inner workings of Congress in the 1860s.
All right. I will definitely. I love smoke-filled rooms and and whiskey barrels. We'll have to definitely sign on for some of that.
Well, you'll enjoy coming to the MAG program this summer.
Fantastic, even better.
I want to thank both of our panelists as well as our participants for some really great questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to more of them. That's a problem we've run into the last several episodes. As a reminder, all of you who are joining us this evening will be receiving an email within the next week. That email will include a link for a certificate of participation. It will also include a link to the archived webinar. Please, please, please share this link with your colleagues. Put it out there on social media. Help us get the word out about the kind of conversations we have going on here. If you have enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider taking a graduate course in our MAG program. We have face-to-face classes this summer. I'm very happy that we're doing that. But then we also have online courses going on through the remainder of the year. You can find more information about our course offerings, as well as all sorts of other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. Our next Documents in Detail webinar, our final one of the 2020-21 season, will take place on Wednesday, May 12th. And on that occasion, our topic will be Frederick Douglass's Oration in Memory of Abraham Lincoln. Joining me to discuss it at that time will be Peter Myers of the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire and my colleague Jason Stevens here at Ashland University. So we look forward to seeing you back here on May 12th. Until then, have a great evening.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free programs, resources, and our documents collection for teachers, students, and citizens at teachingamericanhistory or TAH.org.